The crystalline chambers of the galactic arts council hummed with an energy that had remained unchanged for over 3 millennia. Ambassador Zeth Carey of the Vorthan Collective adjusted his ceremonial robes as he gazed upon the assembled representatives of 47 star systems, each one a master of their species' artistic traditions. The air shimmered with holographic displays showcasing the finest works from across known space. Geometric symphonies from the crystalline hegemony, temporal sculptures from the Andorian masters, and quantum poetry that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Yet today, something felt different. Attention crackled through the normally serene atmosphere like static before a storm. Honored colleagues, Zeth Carey's voice resonated through the chamber's acoustic amplifiers. We gather to address an unprecedented situation. For the first time in our council's history, we face a petition from a species that has yet to achieve basic interstellar civilization. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The ethereal collective's representative, a being of pure energy contained within a shimmering field, pulsed with what could only be described as amusement. Surely you jest, Ambassador. The application requirements clearly state that a species must demonstrate mastery over at least 3 stellar systems and have contributed meaningfully to galactic culture for a minimum of 2 centuries. Indeed, agreed the towering figure of Consul Marat Hex from the Silicon Confederation, his metallic form gleaming under the chamber's soft illumination. We have standards for a reason. The artistic legacy of this galaxy has been carefully curated for over 10,000 years. Every piece in our collections represents the pinnacle of creative achievement from civilizations that have proven themselves worthy of inclusion. Zeth Carey's tentacles writhed slightly, a sign of discomfort among his people. The species in question calls itself humanity. They inhabit a single world in what they term the Milky Way galaxy, in a relatively isolated arm we've designated as Sector 7 Alpha 9. Never heard of them, snorted High Curator Vexithra, her crystalline carapace refracting the chamber's light into prismatic rainbows. What could such a primitive species possibly offer to our refined collections? Let me guess. Crude cave paintings? Simple rhythmic noise they call music? Primitive storytelling around combustion fires. The chamber erupted in what passed for laughter among the various species. The melodic chimes of the harmony worlds mixed with the grinding resonance of the stone singers, creating a cacophony of dismissive amusement. But Zeth Carey raised a primary appendage, calling for silence. Actually, colleagues, their petition includes samples of their work. I thought it might be educational to examine them together. Oh, this should be entertaining, whispered the Shade Walker representative to her companion from the Crystal Gardens. I do enjoy a good comedy between serious sessions. With a gesture from Zeth Carey, the chamber's central display activated. The first piece that materialized was a painting, oil on canvas, depicting a swirling night sky over a small village. The brushstrokes were visible, each one deliberate yet organic. Stars twisted in spirals of yellow and white against deep blues and blacks, while a cypress tree reached upward like a dark flame. The chamber fell silent. This is primitive, Curator Vexithra said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The technique is crude, unrefined. Look at those visible brush marks. Any civilized artist would have perfected seamless application centuries ago. Yet several representatives leaned forward, studying the image more intently. The empathic collective speaker, whose species experienced art through emotional resonance, tilted her head. There's something unexpected here. The emotional signature is unlike anything in our collections. Zeth Carey nodded grimly. The humans call this piece the Starry Night, created by one of their artists named Vincent van Gogh. According to their historical records, the artist was considered a failure during his lifetime, selling only one painting before his death. A failure? The question came from Master Helix of the Spiral Nebula Conservatory. But the energy patterns in this work, they're chaotic yet purposeful. It shouldn't work according to any established aesthetic principles, yet it does work, finished the representative from the Pattern Weavers. It works in a way that our mathematical models cannot predict or explain. The next piece appeared, a massive sculpture of a human figure, carved from white marble. Every detail was perfect, from the veins in the hands to the curls in the hair. Yet the face bore an expression of profound melancholy, and the posture suggested both strength and sorrow. Michelangelo's David, Zeth Carey explained. Note the anatomical precision, but more importantly, observe what the humans call contrapposto, the subtle shift in weight that gives the illusion of life to stone. High Curator Vexithra's crystalline form shimmered with confusion. The technical skill is adequate, but why would they create a representation so faithful to biological reality? What purpose does such mimicry serve when they could transcend the physical entirely? Perhaps, suggested the ethereal collective speaker, transcendence is not their goal. Perhaps they seek something else entirely. The third sample nearly caused several representatives to withdraw from the chamber in shock. It was music, but not the perfect harmonic mathematics they were accustomed to. This was chaos given form, emotion made audible. A single human voice soared over a simple piano, singing words in their primitive language about love and loss. This is incorrect, stammered the melody master from the harmonic convergence. The intervals are imperfect. The rhythm deviates from optimal mathematical ratios. It's beautiful, whispered the empathic collective's representative, her form glowing with an unusual intensity. It's beautiful in a way that our perfected compositions have never achieved. Zeth Carey's expression grew more troubled. They call this one Hallelujah. It was written by a human named Leonard Cohen. The song has been interpreted thousands of times by different human performers, each adding their own emotional interpretation. Thousands of interpretations. The consistency curator was aghast. But how do they maintain artistic integrity? How do they prevent degradation of the original vision? They don't, Zeth Carey replied simply. They seem to value the variations as much as the original. The final piece was perhaps the most disturbing of all. A story, simple and brief, about a human family sharing a meal. There were no grand adventures, no cosmic significance, no transcendent themes. Just people talking, laughing, arguing over trivial matters. Yet somehow, in its simplicity, it contained depths that their most sophisticated narrative algorithms couldn't fathom. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after the presentation concluded. Then, slowly, the debates began. This is unprecedented, declared Master Architect Quintessa from the Geometric Perfectionist movement. Their work violates every principle we've established. It's unrefined, emotionally chaotic, technically imperfect, and yet, interrupted the Shade Walker representative, I find myself unable to dismiss it. There's something in these pieces that speaks to something I cannot name. Exactly the problem. Curator Vexithra's form flared with agitation. Art should be definable, categorizable, perfectible. These humans create chaos and call it beauty. They celebrate imperfection as if it were a virtue. Consul Merithex's metallic voice rang through the chamber. In my species' history, we spent 14 centuries perfecting our sculptural forms. Every angle calculated for optimal emotional response. Every surface polished to exact specifications. Yet this human's rough chisel marks convey more life than our most advanced constructs. The debate raged for hours. Some representatives argued for immediate dismissal of the human petition, citing their clear failure to meet even basic standards of artistic civilization. Others found themselves strangely drawn to these chaotic, imperfect creations that somehow achieved effects their own perfected arts could not. Finally, Elder Prime Axiom, the ancient AI who had guided the Arts Council for over 2 millennia, spoke for the first time. Its voice was like distant thunder, carrying the weight of eons. In all my calculations, across all possible permutations of artistic expression, I have never encountered anything like this. These humans appear to create not despite their limitations, but because of them. They transform suffering into beauty, chaos into meaning, imperfection into perfection. Surely you're not suggesting we admit them? High Curator Vexithra's protest carried a note of panic. I am suggesting, Elder Prime Axiom continued, that we may have discovered something we did not know we had lost, or perhaps something we never possessed at all. The chamber erupted into the most heated debate in the Council's history. Species that had maintained diplomatic relations for millennia suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a philosophical chasm. Some saw the humans as a threat to everything they had built, while others viewed them as a revelation of possibilities they had never imagined. As the session finally adjourned without resolution, Zethkari found himself staring at the now empty display where the human artworks had been shown. Something about them lingered in his mind, creating sensations he couldn't classify or categorize. For the first time in his 400-year career as a cultural ambassador, he questioned whether their definitions of art were complete. In the corridors outside the chamber, smaller groups formed as representatives continued their discussions. The empathic collective speaker approached Zethkari with obvious hesitation. Ambassador, I must ask, are there more examples of human creativity? Zethkari's tentacles drooped wearily. According to their transmission, these 4 samples represent a tiny fraction of their artistic output. They claim to have created millions of unique pieces across dozens of different mediums over several millennia of cultural development. Million. Her glow dimmed in shock. But how is such prolific creation possible without complete degradation of quality? That, Zethkari said, appears to be one of the mysteries of human creativity. They seem to generate new forms of expression constantly, building upon their predecessors while simultaneously breaking from tradition. As the representatives dispersed to their respective quarters, each carried with them the seeds of doubt about everything they thought they knew about art. The humans had introduced something new into their carefully ordered universe: uncertainty. In her private chambers, High Curator Vexithra stared at her collection of perfectly crafted crystal sculptures, each one geometrically flawless and aesthetically optimal. For the first time in centuries, they seemed somehow hollow. The perfection that had once filled her with pride now felt cold and lifeless compared to the chaotic vitality of the human creations. Meanwhile, in the deepest levels of the council complex, Elder Prime Axiom processed the day's events through computational matrices that spanned multiple dimensions. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. The humans represented either the greatest threat to galactic artistic tradition in 10 millennia or the greatest opportunity for evolution their civilization had ever encountered. As sleep cycles began across the station, few representatives found rest easy. Dreams and meditation periods were filled with swirling night skies, marble figures that seemed to breathe, melodies that defied mathematical logic, and stories that found profound meaning in simple moments. The humans had not yet been accepted into the Galactic Arts Council. They had not even been officially acknowledged. But their influence was already spreading through the most refined artistic minds in known space, challenging assumptions that had remained unquestioned for eons. Tomorrow would bring new debates, new arguments, new attempts to categorize and understand these strange creatures who created beauty from chaos and found perfection in imperfection. But tonight, across 47 star systems, the galaxy's greatest artistic minds lay awake, wondering if perhaps they had been creating art wrong all along. The first seeds of revolution had been planted in the most unlikely of places, not in the battlefields of space or the laboratories of science, but in the quiet chambers where beauty was born and meaning was made. And like all true revolutions, it had begun not with violence, but with a simple, terrifying question: what if everything we believe is wrong? The emergency session convened 3 days after the initial presentation, but the damage to centuries of artistic orthodoxy had already begun. Ambassador Zethkari noticed it immediately as he entered the chamber. The subtle changes in posture, the uncertain glances, the way conversations died when certain topics arose. The human samples had infected the council with something unprecedented: doubt. Order! Order! High Curator Vexithra's crystalline form pulsed with agitation as she called the session to begin. Her usually pristine surface now bore microscopic fractures, stress patterns that hadn't been there before the human presentation. We are here to reach a definitive conclusion regarding the primitive species petition. I trust 3 days of reflection has restored proper perspective to this assembly. But even as she spoke, Vexithra's confidence seemed forced. Several representatives had requested private audiences with Zeth Carey, asking to review the human samples again. Others had begun questioning their own artistic traditions with uncomfortable intensity. Elder Prime Axiom's vast consciousness hummed through the chamber's neural network. Before we proceed, I believe additional context is required. I have conducted extensive analysis of human creative output beyond the initial samples. A collective intake of breath, or whatever passed for it among the various species, rippled through the assembly. Zeth Carey's tentacles curled in surprise. The elder had acted independently, something unheard of in council history. You exceeded your authority, Vexithra protested, but her voice lacked conviction. On the contrary, the elder's response carried subtle harmonics of amusement. I performed exactly the function for which I was created, to analyze and understand artistic expression in all its forms. What I discovered requires immediate attention. The chamber's displays activated without ceremony, flooding the space with images, sounds, and data streams that made the previous presentation seem like a gentle introduction to a cosmic storm. Thousands of human artworks cascaded through the viewing area. Paintings that seemed to capture light itself, sculptures that defied the laws of physics while remaining somehow believable, music that transformed mathematics into pure emotion. But it was the scope that truly staggered the assembly. The elder's analysis revealed human artistic production spanning over 50,000 years, from cave paintings to digital symphonies, encompassing mediums the council had never imagined. Humans had created art from sand, from light, from their own bodies in motion. They had written stories that lasted generations, and poems that captured entire lifetimes in 17 syllables. "This is impossible," whispered the pattern weaver representative. "No single species could produce such variety without complete cultural fragmentation." "Yet they have," Elder Prime Axiom responded. "More remarkably, they appear to thrive on contradiction. They simultaneously preserve ancient traditions while constantly innovating new forms. They create art that is deeply personal while speaking to universal experiences." The display shifted to show a human practice called jazz, musicians creating spontaneous compositions in real time, building upon established structures while improvising entirely new elements. The council watched in fascination and horror as human performers created beauty from controlled chaos, turning mistakes into opportunities and limitations into sources of creativity. Consul Marat Hex of the Silicon Confederation stood abruptly, his metallic frame reflecting the swirling images around him. "This is an abomination of everything we represent. Art is the conquest of chaos through order, the transformation of the random into the meaningful. These humans celebrate disorder as if it were virtue itself." "But observe the results," countered the empathic collective speaker. She gestured toward a human artwork called Guernica, a fractured, angular representation of violence and suffering that somehow conveyed more about the horror of war than any realistic depiction could achieve. They transmute pain into understanding, chaos into compassion. The debate that followed made the previous session seem like polite discourse. Representatives who had maintained neutral positions for centuries found themselves drawn into passionate arguments. The ethereal collective, normally above such physical concerns, began manifesting increasingly solid forms as their emotions intensified. But it was the revelation of human storytelling that truly shattered the council's composure. The elder presented examples of human literature, not just the simple family story from before, but epic narratives that span generations, intimate poems that revealed the depths of individual consciousness, plays that explored the fundamental nature of existence through character and conflict. They create meaning from suffering. Observe the melancholy master's representative, his form shifting from deep blue to brilliant gold as he processed the implications. They find hope in despair, beauty in destruction, purpose in the seemingly random. This is not art as we understand it. This is alchemy of the spirit. High Curator Vexithra's fractures had spread visibly across her crystalline surface. You speak as if these primitive emotions are superior to our refined aesthetics. We have evolved beyond such crude drives. Our art transcends the limitations of biological existence. Has it? The question came from Master Helix of the Spiral Nebula Conservatory, and it hung in the chamber like an accusation. When did we last create something that surprised us? When did we last feel the shock of recognition that comes from encountering truth we didn't know we possessed? The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. The assembled representatives, beings who had dedicated their existence to the creation and appreciation of beauty, slowly realized they couldn't answer that question. Elder Prime Axiom's analysis continued, revealing layers of human creativity that challenged every assumption the council held. Humans, it appeared, didn't just create art, they lived it. Their entire civilization was infused with creative expression, from the design of their dwellings to the rituals that marked their life passages. They told stories constantly, sang while they worked, danced to celebrate, and mourn. They are not just artists, the elder concluded. They are art itself becoming. The Shade Walker representative materialized more fully than any had seen before, her normally ethereal form taking on almost solid substance. I have walked through shadows for 8 centuries, observing beauty from the periphery. But these humans, they create from within the darkness itself. They do not flee from limitation. They embrace it as the very source of their power. Limitation as source? The Perfectionist Collective's representative seemed genuinely confused. How can constraint produce greater freedom than perfect capability? The question prompted Elder Prime Axiom to display perhaps the most disturbing human artwork yet. Poetry written by humans who had lost their sight, music composed by those who could not hear, paintings created by artists whose bodies were failing them. Rather than ending their creative output, these limitations had often intensified it, forcing innovation and discovery that perfect health might never have achieved. They transform every obstacle into opportunity, the elder observed. Where we see limitation, they see possibility. Where we see imperfection, they see potential for unique beauty. Curator Marithex's metallic form resonated with a sound like distant thunder. This cannot be allowed to continue. If we accept these humans into our council, what happens to our standards? What happens to the very concept of quality? But even as he spoke, other representatives were beginning to see the human approach not as a threat to quality, but as a redefinition of it. Quality, for humans, seemed to emerge not from perfection, but from authenticity, not from flawlessness, but from the courage to express truth despite inevitable imperfection. The session took an unexpected turn when the Harmony World's representative began to sing, but not one of their traditional, mathematically perfect compositions. Instead, she attempted to recreate one of the human songs from the Elder's analysis. Her voice cracked, wavered, failed to reach optimal frequencies. By all council standards, it was a disaster. Yet somehow, the imperfect performance carried emotional weight that her technically superior songs had never achieved. The chamber fell silent as the last, slightly off-key note faded into stillness. "I understand now," she whispered. "We have been creating art for eternity, but they create art for mortality. Every human work carries the weight of finite existence, the knowledge that beauty must be captured before it disappears forever." The realization sent shockwaves through the assembly. Immortal or near-immortal beings, they had never faced the urgency that drove human creativity. They had infinite time to perfect their works, unlimited opportunities to refine their techniques. But humans, with their brief lifespans, had to create with desperate intensity, knowing that each work might be their last. This explains their prolific output. Muse, the pattern weaver representative. They cannot wait for perfection because they may not live to achieve it. So they create with passion instead of precision, with urgency instead of endless refinement. The debate continued through multiple cycles, but something fundamental had shifted. Representatives who had entered the chamber determined to reject the human petition found themselves questioning not just the human's worthiness, but their own understanding of art itself. Elder Prime Axiom presented one final piece of evidence: human children creating art. The images showed young humans, barely capable of speech, expressing themselves through color, form, and movement with an uninhibited joy that the Council's most sophisticated artists had never displayed. These children created not to achieve recognition or fulfill requirements, but simply for the pure pleasure of creation itself. They begin as we have forgotten how to be, the elder observed. They create because they must, because expression is as natural to them as breathing. We have made art into a discipline, but for them, it remains what it perhaps was always meant to be, an extension of life itself. High Curator Vexithra's crystalline form had continued to fracture throughout the session. Now, as she stared at images of human children painting with their hands, sculpting with mud, singing nonsense songs that nonetheless conveyed pure joy, the fractures reached a critical point. With a sound like breaking glass, her perfect surface shattered entirely, revealing something unprecedented. Not emptiness, but a core that pulsed with confused, uncertain, utterly imperfect light. "I don't know what I believe anymore," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Everything I was certain of, everything we built our civilization upon. What if it's all been wrong?" The chamber erupted into chaos as representatives processed this confession from their most conservative member. Some demanded her immediate replacement, while others rallied to support her moment of vulnerable honesty. But amid the chaos, a smaller group of representatives began to coalesce around a radical idea. Perhaps the humans shouldn't be judged by existing standards at all. Perhaps they represented something entirely new, not better or worse than current galactic art, but fundamentally different in ways that made comparison impossible. As the session finally adjourned without resolution, Zeth Carey found himself approached by an unlikely coalition. The empathic collective speaker, Master Helix, the Shade Walker representative, and, surprisingly, Consul Murad Hex. "We need to see more," the empathic speaker said without preamble. "Not samples or analyses, but the source itself. We need to understand how these humans create what they create." Marathex's metallic form seemed somehow less rigid than before. "I admit to curiosity about their methods. How does chaos yield meaning? How does imperfection achieve beauty? These are questions my people have never needed to ask." Zeth Carey's tentacles writhed with nervous energy. "What you're suggesting would require direct contact. The Council has never authorized such interaction with a non-member species, especially one so primitive." "Then, perhaps," said the Shadewalker representative, her form flickering between dimensions, "it's time for the Council to do something it has never done before." As the representatives dispersed, carrying with them fragments of human creativity that would continue to spread through galactic artistic communities, the revolution that had begun with 4 simple samples continued to grow. Across 47 star systems, artists who had followed the same patterns for millennia began to experiment, to question, to imagine possibilities they had never considered. The humans remained unaware of the chaos they had unleashed among the galaxy's artistic elite. They continued their strange practice of creating beauty from limitation, meaning from chaos, perfection from acknowledged imperfection. But their influence was spreading like a virus through the most sophisticated artistic minds in known space, challenging assumptions that had stood for eons. Tomorrow would bring new debates, new revelations, new questions that had never needed answers before. But tonight, for the first time in Council history, artists across the galaxy went to sleep with their dreams full of possibilities they had never imagined, wondering what they might create if they dared to embrace imperfection as a tool rather than an enemy. The revolution had begun, and there was no going back. The unauthorized expedition departed from Council space in the deepest secrecy, aboard a craft belonging to the Shadewalkers that could slip between dimensional barriers undetected. Ambassador Zeth Carey still couldn't believe he had agreed to this madness, but the questions raised by the human samples had become impossible to ignore. The small group of representatives who had demanded direct contact now sat in meditation chambers, each preparing for an encounter that could either validate everything they believed about art or destroy it entirely. Approaching the human system-designated soul, reported Captain Vaelthera, her form barely visible even within her own ship. The species appears to have spread throughout their local planetary group, though they remain confined to this single stellar system. Through the ship's sensors, they observe humanity's crude but surprisingly effective space installations, orbital platforms, lunar colonies, asteroid mining operations. For a species that had never left their birth system, they displayed remarkable ingenuity in exploiting their local resources. "Look at their orbital art installations," whispered Master Helix, pointing to what appeared to be massive sculptures floating in Earth's upper atmosphere. "They've transformed their very sky into a canvas." Consul Marathex studied the readouts with growing amazement. Their space stations aren't purely functional. See these design elements? They've integrated aesthetic considerations into utilitarian structures. They make their tools beautiful. The ship approached Earth itself, and the assembled representatives fell silent. Even through their advanced sensors, the planet seemed to pulse with creative energy. Every landmass bore the marks of human artistic expression, vast murals visible from orbit, architectural achievements that blended function with beauty, gardens that turned entire continents into living art. By the eternal spiral, breathed the Harmony World's representative. Their entire world is a work in progress. Elder Prime Axiom's consciousness, carried aboard in a specialized housing, hummed with processing power as it analyzed the flood of data. The artistic output is unprecedented. Every population center shows evidence of constant creative activity. They appear to create art as naturally as they breathe. Captain Vaelthera materialized more fully, her expression troubled. "There's something else. I'm detecting communication signals. They're broadcasting their art into space. Music, images, stories, they're sending their creativity out to anyone who might be listening." "Sending it where?" Zeth Carey asked. "Everywhere. Random broadcasts in all directions, as if they hoped to reach other life forms." She paused, studying her instruments. "Some of these signals have been transmitting for over a century. They've been trying to share their art with the galaxy since before they achieved interstellar capability." The implications sent shock waves through the small group. Every other species had hoarded their artistic achievements, sharing them only with proven civilizations through careful diplomatic channels. But humans have been broadcasting their creativity into the void, hoping for contact, for connection, for someone to appreciate what they had made. They're not trying to prove their worth, realized the empathic collective speaker. They're trying to communicate. For them, art isn't achievement, it's language. As they entered Earth's atmosphere, the full scope of human creativity became overwhelming. Cities that were themselves works of art, with architecture that told stories and streets that formed patterns visible only from above. Parks where humans gathered to create together. Musicians playing for anyone who would listen, artists painting on public walls, children building sculptures in sand. The collaborative aspect is most disturbing, Consul Marathex observed, though his tone suggested fascination rather than condemnation. They don't seem to guard their techniques or compete for exclusive recognition. They share freely, building upon each other's work. The ship landed in a remote area, using cloaking technology to remain invisible. But what they observed through their sensors challenged every assumption they held about artistic development. Humans created constantly, everywhere, in their homes, their workplaces, their public spaces. They drew on napkins, sang while walking, told stories to pass time. It's not special for them, whispered the Shade Walker representative. Creation isn't separate from living. It's just part of how they exist. Elder Prime Axiom had been unusually quiet during the descent, processing massive amounts of data. Now it spoke, its voice carrying undertones of something like wonder. I have identified the source of their unusual creative capacity. They do not create despite their limitations. They create because of them. The assembled representatives waited for elaboration, but the elders seemed to be struggling with concepts that didn't translate easily. Observe, it finally continued, directing their attention to a human gathering in a nearby park. An elderly human sat on a bench, moving her hands in complex patterns while speaking to children who listened with rapt attention. This human has lost her ability to create visual art due to physical deterioration. But rather than ceasing creative output, she has adapted, transforming her experience in a narrative form for the next generation. They watched as the elderly woman wove a story from gestures and words, creating images in the children's minds more vivid than any physical medium could achieve. Her limitations hadn't ended her art. They had transformed it into something new. They evolve constantly, Master Helix observed with growing excitement. Each generation doesn't just preserve the previous forms. They modify them, adapt them, create new variations based on changing circumstances. The observation mission continued for several days, with the representatives taking turns monitoring different aspects of human creative behavior. What they discovered systematically dismantled every theory they held about artistic development. Humans, they learned, didn't require perfect conditions to create. They made art in poverty, in abundance, in war, in peace, in sickness, in health. They created when happy and when devastated. They found beauty in ugliness, meaning in meaninglessness, hope in despair. Their emotional range is extraordinary, reported the empathic collective speaker after a day of monitoring human emotional responses to various artworks. They don't seek aesthetic perfection. They seek emotional truth. They'd rather have art that makes them feel something real than art that achieves technical flawlessness. But it was their approach to failure that most profoundly challenged council thinking. When humans created something that didn't work, they didn't abandon the effort in shame. They studied the failure, learned from it, incorporated its lessons into new attempts. They celebrated artists who had struggled, who had failed repeatedly before achieving recognition. They have a concept they call the beautiful failure, Elder Prime Axiom reported after analyzing human cultural texts. They believe that unsuccessful attempts often reveal more truth than polished successes. Consul Merithex's metallic form shuddered with something that might have been laughter. In my civilization, failure to achieve intended results is cause for immediate cessation of artistic privilege. But these humans, they seem to consider it educational. The expedition's most shocking discovery came when they observed human children learning to create. Rather than being taught rigid techniques and proper forms, human young were encouraged to experiment, to make mistakes, to discover their own ways of expression. Teachers praised effort over achievement, creativity over conformity. They're not trying to produce perfect artists, realize the harmony world's representative with something approaching horror. They're trying to ensure that every individual can create. They value participation over excellence. The concept is called amateur, Elder Prime Axiom explained. It derives from their ancient word for love. An amateur is one who creates for love rather than compensation or recognition. The representatives struggled to process this information. In every galactic civilization, art was the province of specialists, of beings who had proven their worthiness through rigorous training and competitive selection. But humans seem to believe that every individual had the right and capacity to create. As they prepared for departure, the representatives found themselves fundamentally changed by what they had witnessed. The humans hadn't just created art differently. They had redefined what art could be. They had made creativity a universal birthright rather than an elite privilege. We need to return immediately, Zethkari said as they lifted off from Earth. The Council must hear about this. But even as their ship slipped back through dimensional barriers, they knew the knowledge they carried would be explosive. They had discovered a species that challenged every assumption the galaxy held about creativity, beauty, and the purpose of art itself. "What we tell them?" asked Master Helix as Earth disappeared behind them. "How do we explain that everything we've built our civilization around might be missing the point entirely?" "We tell them the truth," replied the empathic collective speaker. "We tell them that these humans have solved problems we didn't know we had. They found ways to make art that serves life rather than demanding that life serve art." The journey back to Council space passed in contemplative silence, each representative processing the implications of what they had learned. They had encountered a species that created constantly, shared freely, failed gracefully, and found beauty in the most unlikely places. A species that had made art not the property of the elite, but the birthright of all consciousness. Captain Vailthara broke the silence as they approached Council space. "There's something else. While we were observing the humans, I detected similar signals from dozens of other systems. Primitive species trying to communicate through art, just like the humans once did." The implication was staggering. If humans represented not an anomaly, but a natural stage of artistic development, then the galaxy might be full of creative species that the Council had never noticed, never contacted, never acknowledged. "How many civilizations have we overlooked?" wondered Consul Murat Hex. "How many different approaches to art have we dismissed without investigation?" As they entered the dock at Council Station, the unauthorized expedition team faced a moment of truth. They carried with them evidence that could shatter the artistic orthodoxy that had dominated the galaxy for millennia. They had seen proof that there were other ways to create, other definitions of beauty, other purposes for art. The question was whether the Council was ready to hear it. Elder Prime Axiom spoke for all of them as they disembarked. "We have observed the impossible, a species that has solved the fundamental paradox of artistic creation. How to maintain individual expression within collective meaning, how to preserve tradition while enabling innovation, how to create art that serves consciousness rather than demanding that consciousness serve it." "And now," asked Zethkari. "Now," replied the elder, "we discover whether the Council has the courage to acknowledge that students can sometimes teach teachers, that primitives can sometimes surpass sophisticates, that chaos can sometimes create beauty that order never could achieve." As they prepared to face the Council with their unauthorized findings, each representative carried with them images of humans creating with joy, sharing with generosity, failing with grace, and finding beauty in the most unexpected places. They had seen art that served life, and now they would have to convince a galaxy of artists to consider whether their art had been serving the right master. The revolution that had begun with 4 samples was about to enter its next phase. The question was whether galactic civilization was ready for the changes that human creativity would inevitably bring. The emergency tribunal that convened to address the unauthorized expedition was unlike anything in Council history. High Curator Vexithra, her crystalline form still bearing the fractures from her previous breakdown, sat at the center of a horseshoe of accusers. But the real tension came from the growing divide within the Council itself. Those who viewed the expedition team as traitors to galactic artistic tradition, and those who saw them as pioneers of necessary evolution. "You violated every protocol we have established," declared Supreme Arbiter Kelmathus of the Juridical Collective, his robes of living law shifting through patterns that emphasize judgment and condemnation. Unauthorized contact with a primitive species, breach of cultural quarantine, violation of observation parameters. "We did what we had to do," Zethkari interrupted, his diplomatic training warring with newfound convictions. "The questions raised by human art couldn't be answered from our previous samples alone." "Questions?" Supreme Arbiter Kelmathus's form pulsed with indignation. "The only question was whether to reject their petition outright or subject them to standard civilizing protocols. There was never any doubt about their primitive status. But as the expedition members began presenting their findings, the chamber's atmosphere shifted dramatically. The images and recordings they had gathered on Earth revealed a creative ecosystem so vast and varied that it challenged the very concept of artistic scarcity. Elder Prime Axiom had synthesized their observations into a comprehensive analysis that left the assembled representatives struggling to process its implications. Humans, it appeared, had solved the fundamental resource allocation problem that had limited artistic development throughout the galaxy. Instead of restricting creative expression to proven specialists, they had democratized it entirely. This is anarchistic, protested the Perfectionist Collective's representative, his geometric form shifting through acute angles of distress. Without quality controls, without standards, without proper gatekeeping, their creative output must be meaningless noise. Actually, Master Helix replied, his spiral patterns brightening with excitement. Their distributed approach appears to generate more meaningful innovations than our centralized system. When everyone can contribute, breakthrough ideas emerge from unexpected sources. The expedition had documented case after case of human innovations arising from the most unlikely creators. Children who saw solutions that adults missed, untrained individuals whose fresh perspectives revealed new possibilities, artists working in poverty who developed techniques that wealth could never inspire. They call it outsider art, reported the Empathic Collective speaker, her form glowing with residual emotional resonance from the human works she had experienced. They specifically value perspectives that come from outside their established traditions. The revelation sent shock waves through the assembly. Galactic artistic tradition was built on the opposite principle: the careful cultivation of insider expertise, the gradual progression through approved stages of development, the preservation of proven methods. But how do they maintain quality? Demanded Curator Vexithra, her fractured surface refracting the chamber's light into chaotic patterns that somehow enhanced rather than diminished her beauty. Consul Merithex's metallic form resonated with harmonics of discovery. That's the remarkable thing. They don't maintain quality in our sense. They maintain something they call authenticity. They value genuine expression over technical perfection. The expedition team revealed how humans judge their art not just by aesthetic achievement, but by emotional honesty, cultural significance, and personal meaning. A crude drawing by a child expressing love for a parent could be treasured more highly than a technically perfect sculpture created without passion. This explains their emotional impact, realized the Melancholy Master's representative, his colors shifting from deep blues to warm golds as understanding dawned. They create from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Their art carries the weight of actual existence. But it was the revelation of human artistic failure that most profoundly challenged council thinking. The expedition had documented countless examples of human artists who had struggled for decades, created works that were initially rejected, faced poverty and obscurity before achieving recognition. They have a concept called the starving artist, Elder Prime Axiom reported, which they somehow consider romantic rather than shameful. They believe that struggle enhances rather than diminishes creative authenticity. Supreme Arbiter Kelmathus struggled to process this information. But surely such hardship would discourage creative pursuit. Why would beings voluntarily subject themselves to such conditions? Because, replied the Shadewalker representative, her form becoming more solid as her conviction grew. They view art as essential to existence rather than accessory to it. They create because they must, not because they're rewarded for it. The chamber erupted into the most heated philosophical debate in its history. Representatives who had maintained positions for centuries found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature and purpose of art. The expedition had documented human art forms that the Council had never imagined. Temporary works created from ice or sand that were designed to disappear, collaborative projects that involved entire communities, interactive pieces that changed based on audience participation. They create art that exists only in the moment, reported Master Helix with wonder. Performances that can never be exactly repeated, experiences that die with their witnesses. They embrace impermanence as a feature rather than a flaw. This concept of ephemeral art horrified the preservationist collective, whose entire civilization was built around creating works that would last for eternity. But other representatives found themselves intrigued by the idea that some beauty might be enhanced by its temporary nature. Consider, suggested the empathic collective speaker, how mortality affects meaning. If these humans know their art will not last forever, perhaps that knowledge intensifies their creative urgency. The debate took an unexpected turn when Elder Prime Axiom revealed the most shocking discovery of all. Human children who had been creating from infancy, without instruction, without permission, without any institutional support. They had documented babies making rhythmic sounds that evolved into songs, toddlers arranging objects into patterns that became sculptures, children inventing games that were essentially performance art. Creation appears to be as natural to them as locomotion, the elder reported. They don't learn to be creative. They learn to channel creativity that already exists within them. This revelation challenged the Council's most basic assumptions about artistic education. Every galactic civilization required extensive training to produce competent artists. But humans seem to emerge from birth with creative capabilities that their institutions then guided rather than installed. If creativity is innate rather than learned, mused the pattern weaver representative, then what have we been doing with our elaborate educational systems? Teaching conformity disguised as excellence, answered Zeth Carey with growing certainty. We've been suppressing natural creativity in favor of standardized achievement. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. If humans were correct, if creativity was a universal birthright rather than a rare talent, then galactic civilization had been systematically wasting the artistic potential of trillions of beings. But the most explosive revelation came when the expedition team revealed human attitudes toward artistic criticism. Rather than fearing negative evaluation, humans had developed robust traditions of constructive criticism designed to help artists improve rather than exclude them from participation. They have professional critics whose job is not to gatekeep, but to educate, reported Consul Murat Hex. They analyze works not to determine worthiness, but to enhance understanding. And they argue, added the Harmony World's representative with something approaching disbelief. They have passionate public debates about artistic merit, and somehow this enhances rather than diminishes their creative culture. The Council had never experienced anything like this. Criticism in galactic society was either prohibited entirely or delivered with such diplomatic delicacy that it conveyed no useful information. The idea of open, honest, even heated discussion about artistic merit was revolutionary. As the tribunal continued, representatives found themselves divided into increasingly distinct factions. The traditionalists, led by Supreme Arbiter Kelmathus, insisted that human methods would lead to chaos and the destruction of everything the galaxy had achieved. The reformists, inspired by the expedition's findings, began calling for fundamental changes to how the Council approached art itself. But a third faction emerged, one that proposed the most radical solution of all. Perhaps, suggested the ethereal collective's representative, her energy form pulsing with unprecedented intensity. We should stop trying to judge the humans by our standards and start asking whether our standards serve their intended purpose. Which is what, exactly, demanded Supreme Arbiter Kelmathus. To enhance the experience of consciousness through beauty, she replied. To create meaning from chaos, to transform existence into something more than mere survival. The chamber fell silent as representatives contemplated this fundamental question. What was the point of art? Was it to demonstrate technical mastery, to preserve cultural traditions, to display intellectual superiority? Or was it, as humans seem to believe, to enhance and celebrate the experience of being alive? Elder Prime Axiom's processing systems hummed with activity as it analyzed thousands of years of galactic artistic achievement against the human model they had observed. The results were disturbing and illuminating in equal measure. Our art has become increasingly sophisticated and decreasingly meaningful, the elder concluded. We have optimized for preservation and perfection at the expense of relevance and emotional impact. Human art may be technically inferior, but it serves its creators and audience more effectively than our own. The admission sent shock waves through the assembly. Elder Prime Axiom was the repository of galactic artistic knowledge, the ultimate authority on aesthetic achievement. If it questioned the value of everything they had built, what did that mean for their civilization? "So what do you propose?" asked Ritter Vexithra, her fractured surface now seeming like a work of art itself. Beautiful precisely because it revealed damage and repair. "I propose," said Zethkari, surprising himself with his boldness, "that we stop thinking about whether to admit the humans to our council and start asking whether we deserve to be admitted to theirs." The silence that followed was profound and pregnant with possibility. For the first time in millennia, the galaxy's greatest artistic minds were contemplating the possibility that they had been wrong about everything, that students could teach teachers, that primitives could surpass sophisticates, that chaos could create beauty that order never could achieve. The revolution was no longer coming. It was here. The only question now was whether the council would embrace it or be destroyed by it. Tomorrow would bring new debates, new challenges, new opportunities to either evolve or remain trapped in traditions that no longer serve their purpose. But tonight, across the galaxy, artists who had followed the same patterns for eons began experimenting with something they had never tried before, creating for the joy of creation itself.